Well, welcome to today's tutoring session. Sit right down there and let's talk about population geography. Now, something that's very handy in your textbook and ebook is there is an appendix of demographic data in the back. We may refer to this at one time or another when we look at example countries. Now, the slide says, um, consider your assigned demographic variable and then explain the meaning of it. Okay, for example, we're only looking at one small portion of the entire table, but you have rows for the world regions, individual countries. Well, if you have a number that's in there, things like birth rates, death rates, things like total fertility rate, it's a number. But what's the meaning of that number? Things like infant mortality rate, what does that say about a place? Or numbers like median age. What can that tell us in these about these places? All right, so make sure that you're able to access Appendix 3 in your ebook, and I may reference that from time to time. Here are the learning objectives. And some of the preliminary photos from the book, looking at some densely populated areas, Cairo, Shanghai, Hong Kong. Now, just because an area is densely populated, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's overpopulated. Overpopulation is a value judgment, as we'll see later. Okay, well, I sometimes call this chapter the demography chapter, but it's probably better known as population geography. All right, what is demography and what is population geography? Those are the next questions. Well, demography just means the statistical study of the human population. And there are demographers in other fields of study. There are demographers in economics, there are demographers in sociology, the health sciences, and so forth, may also employ demographers. Well, what does geography have to offer this interdisciplinary study of the human population? What does geography have to offer? Well, because it's geography, then we have to relate it to space and place. We look at the physical environment and how that influences population numbers and density and resource use and so forth. So those environmental relationships are certainly important. And very importantly, the mapping things out, looking at the demographics spatially and seeing that if there is anything that can tell us. All right, so I can go around the classroom or just ask you, what demographic information do you need to know? For example, for your research or for your business, what would be the demographic information you would want? What is it about the populations in particular areas or to compare areas that you would want to know? Would you want to know such things as the age distribution of an area or the sex ratio in an area? Perhaps you're in marketing, all right, and you need to market your product to particular demographics, say different ethnic groups of a particular age and so forth. All of those things are demographic information. I might also draw your attention to the U.S. Census Bureau's webpage. They have a very nice population clock where you look at the webpage and there's a counter that says what the world population is and also what the U.S. population is. So we may take a look at some of these in the classroom. Well, while I generally don't have you memorize a lot of numbers in this class, there's probably some numbers that you ought to have a handle on. So for discussing it or talking about these issues, for example, all world citizens should know the approximate human population of the world. If you're going to be throwing facts around, throwing numbers around, you probably should have an idea about that. And also, how fast is it growing? And then also, if you're a U.S. citizen, well, you probably ought to know what the approximate current population of the United States is, and also how fast it's growing. Now, you could look this up in the table of demographic data. And I've done that for you here. All right, this is what they have in the back of the book, the end of the ebook in Appendix 3. Now, it's 2019 data, because by the time that they collected the data sheet, that's a lag of time, and then there's a lag of time in publication. So here we are in 2022, and we're looking at 2019 data. Can we still use it? Yes, we can. All right, you take a look at the world population. All right, that's 7,691,500,000 is what's in the table. It's actually grown a little bit from that number by 2022. If you look at the U.S. Census website, we're creeping closer to 8 billion now. And the rate of natural increase, that's what RNR is, 1.1%. Well, that doesn't seem like very much. 1.1% interest rate, return on investment. In this case, the rate of natural increase, that's the births over deaths, is the rate of natural increase. It seems like a puny number. If you went to the bank and you wanted to know what the return on their CDs were, they said 1.1%. Well, that seems pretty small. But that small number multiplied by the big number, the world population, gives another pretty big number. So that's more than 80-some million, the mid-80s, on average about right now, because we have to account for the increases since 2019. What, about 85 million every year? Well, is 85 million people coming into the world? Well, actually not just coming into the world, but that's net, because that's births over deaths. The world increase of that many, is that a lot? Well, compare that to what the population of the United States is. Now, at the time, it's gone up a little bit since then, but we're looking at 330 million in the United States. So you figure about every 4 years, the world adds in a population equal to that of the United States. Now, we have a relatively small rate of natural increase. See, we're not even at 1.1%. We're at 0.3% of our births minus our deaths. Our immigration rate is greater than our natural increase rate. And probably when we look at the last census data, you're going to have more than 330 million. All right, so those are some comparable numbers. So whenever you're arguing about world population and talking about those issues, it's okay to say almost 8 billion. And if you're talking about the U.S. population, if you said the whole 330 million, you'd be within the ballpark for that. Some of the trends, okay, well, the Earth's population is getting closer and closer to 8 billion people. How does the world population grow? Well, by natural increase, births over deaths. So you don't account for immigration there because nobody comes into Earth and nobody leaves Earth. So for individual countries, the natural increase might be insignificant to the number of people that are coming in or the number of people leaving. Sometimes when there's a refugee crisis, you have an emigration uh, rate that can be quite high. All right, but on a worldwide basis, it's the rate of natural increase. That's an important number to know about. Well, let's see, for UN projections, are noting that because of the decline in fertility rates worldwide, the human population is starting to level off, but there's a significant amount of agreement as to at what point it's going to level off. A little bit less than 10 billion, close to 13 billion. What's the guess on that? You see, one of the big differences between you taking this class in 2022 and me taking this class in 1979 was that in the 1970s, the professors were trying to scare us with the threat of overpopulation, that the world was growing so rapidly that there would be too many people and that the world would run out of resources and so forth. That hadn't come to pass, though, although you may hear academics in the other sciences, biology perhaps, maybe political science and sociology, that do see the issue of world overpopulation as a problem. Probably not anymore. You don't hear people talking about the population problem or the population bomb or overpopulation as much anymore, at least not for the world as a whole. Maybe particular regions or particular countries, that's an issue. However, the Malthusians, or those that see that there's a world population explosion that may be the death of humanity, I will give them that it's true. A finite vessel can't increase and increase and increase. Even if we get our growth rate down to a slow amount, at some point the human population is going to have to level off. Okay, well, at this point, let's take a look at the table of the world's largest countries. And what I'm going to do, you can also find this information from a data sheet, the Population Reference Bureau, which our appendix is based on that. I've included the web link there. And this was in the previous book. This is the top 10 most populous, not most popular, most populous countries. Click that, and so these are the changes. Who's gone up the list and who's off of the list now? Oh, Japan is off of the list now. Still the largest country in population terms is China, followed by India. United States, we're right up there. But remember, the world adds in about a quarter of the population of the United States every year. Indonesia, also rapidly growing. Pakistan, way up there, Brazil, Nigeria is Nigeria moving up the list, and Russia is still on the list. Now Mexico is on the list, replacing Japan. All right, so let's take a look, and then there's also the predicted in 2050. What will it be? You have some changeover. You have some new players there. You have Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia on there. Oh, and also 2050, India is projected to be the largest country in the world in population terms. Well, whenever we talk about countries, it necessitates knowing a little bit of world geography. And so would it be a good exercise to ask students, when you look at that top 10 countries of the world list, and would you be able to find them on a world map? Okay, let's look at some of the other generalizations that's going on here. Here's a graph from your textbook, and let me use the highlighter here. This is the graph of human population around the time of the Industrial Revolution to present. It's pointing at the world total. This is where we are on the graph right now. And you'd probably have to say that we're still in a time period of human history of rapid population growth here at this point, even though it's projected that the human population, even though it's going to grow, will start to level off sometime in the future. I'm off of the chart here, but sometime in the future it is expected to level off, but at what number? All right, so this rate of growth, this is only at 1.1%. All right, now the graph also shows that there's a big distinction between the less developed countries and regions and the more developed countries and regions, and that most of this projected population growth in the coming decades is going to be in the less developed regions. Well, this necessitates some discussion of, well, what's the difference between more developed and less developed countries? There really is no definition of that in the readings. It's just one of these things that you're expected to know. You're expected to know what development means. Well, the developed countries, those are the rich countries, right? And then the less developed countries, those are the poorer countries. But how exactly do you define what development is, or standard of living? That's one other important part of demography, population geography, and economic geography, is studying that. One way to cut to the chase would be for me to just ask you, well, give me an example of 5 developed world countries, and then give me an example of 5 less developed countries. Now, if you want to name developed countries, you want to talk about the rich countries of the world, United States and Canada, the countries of Western Europe, France, United Kingdom, Germany, and then Japan, South Korea, and in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand. Those are all considered to be the developed countries. But the developing, see, sometimes the phrase is, instead of undeveloped or less developed, come on, give them a break, they're developing countries. And those are the poor countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So if you named a country in sub-Saharan Africa, a country like Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Namibia, or in Latin America, Guatemala or Honduras, or Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world. And in Asia, Afghanistan is probably the world's poorest country. India, Bangladesh are also considered to be developing countries, or part of the less developed world. Now, this distinction between developed and less developed is lessening more and more every year, and it's getting to the point now where it's almost irrelevant. Yet still, when we look at the population graph of, most of the growth will be in the less developed countries, well, we have to be able to point that out. Now, in the past, we used to talk about the term third world country. And what's a third world country? The term has fallen out of favor. What is third world? See, some people don't like it. For example, if I referred to Mexico as being a third world country, people would be shocked. They'd go, "Oh, you insulted Mexico because you called it a third world country." Well, it is, but when you say third world, that doesn't mean second rate or worse. There's a meaning to these phrases: first world, second world, third world, and so forth. The original terminology goes way back to the Cold War. Right after World War II, the world split itself apart into 2 camps. You had the first world, which was the the Western countries, the Western democracies, the free market capitalist countries, they were richer, and that's the first world. And then the communist alternative, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and then a little bit later, Red China coming in, that was the second world. And then all the poor countries that couldn't control their own destinies, that were caught between the push and pull of the world superpowers, we term those areas the third world. So it means the poor countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You could probably find different schemes for which countries may be considered third world or not. And some there are a transition. And there's also another usage of this, and I hate this, but some people throw the terms first world, second world, third world, fourth world around, meaning that the richest countries in the world, that's the first world, and the second richest countries are the second world, and the third richest country is the third world, yeah, and so on, fourth and fifth world or something like that. That's ridiculous. The original terminology comes from Cold War thinking, so you don't have to worry about the Cold War. It's over. There was a war between the United States and Soviet Union. It was never a hot war, but it was a Cold War. All right, maybe you'll save some of that discussion for political geography sometime. And then, indeed, this is what I just told you. How else can you measure development and say, why is this country part of the developed world and this other place it's not part of the developed world? And who are you to say what's a nice area and what's a bad area? Where the standard of living is pretty good and where the standard of living is pretty bad. How can you measure that? How can you quantitatively say who's rich or who's poor? Well, let's take a look at this map. Actually, this one comes up in the next chapter, 6 on cultural geography. We're looking at technological development, but it's very useful in this chapter because it kind of shows you where the less developed countries are. So this is as measured by the percentage of labor force engaged in agriculture. Well, in countries like the United States, less than 1% of the population is engaged in agriculture. But in many parts of the world, in the poorer countries, large portions of the population are engaged in agriculture, and a lot of times subsistence agriculture. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it does really show it, that the poorer countries in Asia, Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and getting into Latin America are the poorer countries. And within Latin America, poorer countries like Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala are poorer than Mexico. And Argentina has a lot of industry, but a country like Bolivia is poor. Okay, so, and it is kind of ironic, isn't it? Because if this is the countries where you have so many starving people and all that, well, they're mostly farmers, though. They're agrarian. A large percentage of the population is engaged in agriculture. A lot of places, subsistence. Or how else might you measure development or standard of living? This is getting to be a rather old map, but again, it's from the next chapter, technological differences between areas. This is internet users. Well, it kind of jumps out at you that, the US and Canada, Europe, particularly Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the developed world country, they have a lot of internet use. They're well connected. Whereas you get into these isolated areas in Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, they're poorer and they're not going to be well connected to the internet. I always like to point out this humorous place here in North Korea. There's only one person that's allowed to use the internet. Well, what if you just counted the money? Count up all the money in the country and divide it by how many people there are. That would be fair, right? Well, anyways, that would give you an average. And if you did that, if you looked up the table in the back of the book for the United States, if you take all the money in the country, divide by how many of this there are, we all have, I think it's $44,000. All right, so that's the case in the United States and Canada. In Europe, so there's a big difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. The communist socialist countries are a lot poorer than the capitalist countries are. And you see the range of development within Latin America. Mexico has industrialized rapidly in recent years. It's uneven, and you have some exceptions to the rule here or there. We'll look at this when we study economic geography. But for right now, that's one measurable way to measure standard of living. Although when you want to look at money, sometimes in some places the dollar or the unit of money goes a lot further in some places that might be poorer places, but the cost of living might be a little less. So this is one attempt to equalize that, but still, you see the problems in Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, and in part of our popular culture speaking, we sometimes make these observations about first world problems versus third world problems. What would be an example of a first world problem? A first world problem might be that Starbucks gets your coffee order wrong. It would be a first world problem. Whereas living in a less developed countries and having to walk a mile in order to access clean water, that's a third world problem. Okay, here in the United States, we have our problems, but very often it's problems of things being too plentiful. Now, this is always talked about in social justice, especially that look at things on the global scale. It's always the North versus the South. It's the rich countries versus the poor countries. The rich industrialized countries, they're in the North, and they exploit and oppress the poor countries of the South. It's not entirely geographical, as you can see. For one thing, look at where the equator is. And Australia, New Zealand, they're part of the North, if that makes sense. But this was the split between developed and less developed world. In 1980, that's a long time ago, UN Brent Report, which to talk about economic development and developing and less developed countries, it's less and less relevant every year as the world equalizes, as globalization proceeds, and the less developed countries are modernizing rapidly. But it still is useful to talk about the less developed countries or areas of the third world. Everyone knows what you're talking about in those cases. All right. Moving on to some of the other terms and concepts from the book. Let's see, rates and cohort measures. Like you have a birth rate, death rate, and so forth. So frequency occurrence during a specified time period. So we're going to be looking at maps of all the rates. What's a cohort? Well, this will come up when we look at the age-sex distribution of populations, population pyramids, and so forth. That's a population group that's unified because of some common characteristic, or usually cohorts and generations can be used synonymously. Let's take a look at some information on that. Right, who are your cohorts? What generation are you? Anyways, you're not Generation X. Are you millennials? Are you Generation Z? Uh, I'm part of the baby boom generation. And that's us. What do we mean by baby boom? Well, the post-World War II, soldiers coming back, and it was a big increase in the number of babies and everything else. Economy was booming and so forth. So those born between 1946 and 1964, and I'm a member of that group. Although now the baby boomers are aging. Many of us are retired or reaching retirement age. So we're an age cohort. You can talk about us as a group. And you may also talk about millennials, Generation X, Generation Z, those born 1997 to 2010. So that's an age cohort. This comes up when we look at population pyramids. Okay, well, let's take a look at some of these maps and these demographic statistics and look at them and try to draw some explanation about each one of these. Now, the first one is crude birth rate. And so you have a map in the textbook, ebook. All right, and you know what? I found a blooper on there. I don't know if they've corrected it in the ebook yet. I'd have to complain about that. There's a mistake in the legend. It says live births per 100 population. That's supposed to be 1,000. All right, that's not correct. All right, so crude birth rate is always talked about as a number per 1,000. I can even show you here how crude birth rate is calculated. And why is it crude? What exactly about the crude birth rate is crude? What makes it crude? And then also, generally, what we do is I go around the classroom and I ask people to see with all of these map statistics. For one thing, is there a geographic pattern to the map? And in this case, I think that you could say that there is a pattern. And then I'd ask them, well, what is that pattern? And you could probably make the conclusion that, well, the less developed countries tend to have the higher birth rates. Okay? And then the next part of it would be, well, why is that the case? Why is it that you have higher birth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, within Latin America, it's uneven. Why is it greater here and less there? Discuss the geography of it. Well, overall, it's because of development. Again, the countries that are the most agrarian, it's an advantage to have a large number of children in those types of situations. Whereas in the developed world, children can be more of a liability, people delaying marriage, more women in the workforce, and so forth. Birth rates are usually less in the developed countries. As a matter of fact, in your quiz bank, test bank, there are several questions that are all on that concept. So if you see one of those, birth rates are greater in the less developed countries. Or if the question is, where are the birth rates lower? Well, that's in the developed world countries. Why is it crude? We have to get to that point. What makes it crude exactly? Well, first off, let's see how it's calculated. Now, it didn't help that the legend had a blooper in there, but let's see. So let's say for an example country X, in 1 year there were 40,000 births. Their population was 2 million. So what's the birth rate? Well, 40,000 divided by 2 million is 0.02, right? Well, 0.02 is just another way of saying 2%. 2% is just another way of saying 2 per 100. 2 per 100 is just another way of saying 20 per 1,000. So we have on the legend for the CBR map, it's a number per thousand. It's almost always expressed as a number per thousand. What makes it crude, though? Why do they call it crude birth rate? Well, because it's not age and sex adjusted, because here it's total births over total population. Well, men don't give birth, and very young women don't give birth, and very old women don't give birth. They're part of the total population. That's the reason why they call it crude birth rate. It's not crude because they're just guessing at it or something. All right, and here are some notes that I would say. There's a lot of things that explain that. Most of it is level of development. Yes, social customs can come in. Sometimes governmental policies. Some governments seek to reduce population sizes. China's one-child policy and other countries also had restrictive ones. Whereas in other countries, they actually try to increase the birth rate and try to encourage families to have more children. In the old Soviet Union, they would give medals to women that had 5 or more children. Similarly, in Romania, ended up a situation where you had a large number of Romanian orphans in that country and other areas of Eastern Europe as a legacy of such pro-natalist governmental policies. All right, so yeah, the higher rates are in the more agrarian ones, lower rates in the more industrialized. Something about rates versus actual numbers, you do have to be careful with this type of thing. Well, this data is getting a little bit old here, but when you look at the birth rate map, and you look on there, you find a place where the crude birth rate is very high. You look in Mali, and I look it up in the table. It has a crude birth rate of 48 per thousand, whereas China only has 12 per thousand. So you look at that map, you see China has a light color, and Mali has a real dark color. And then asking the question, where do you have more births going on? Well, everyone would say, well, Mali, because it's shaded in the higher category. But actually, there's a lot fewer. If you're actually looking at the actual number. Yeah, the rate is higher, but not the actual number. All right, so for example, at the time, this is 2006 data. China's 1.3 billion population added in 16 million people every year, whereas Mali only had 3 million, so it only added in about 150,000. Okay, so where do you have the most births numerically versus the highest rates? Now look, this is a warning. You go out into the real world, people are going to try to trick you on things. There's a big difference between the number of something and a percentage of something. All right, you'll find out. Usually when I go around the classroom and I ask students, why is it that the birth rate is so much higher in these areas of the less developed countries? And they always look at it as a technological problem. In that, I guess that's how Westerners would tend to look at everything. Everything's our technology. Or they say things like, well, because in those third world countries, the people are uneducated, they don't know how to use birth control, or they can't afford birth control, or there's some societal pressure against using it. And to some extent, that's partially true. I mean, all through the 60s and 70s, into the 80s, places like the World Bank, the United Nations, Peace Corps, were trying to go into the less developed areas and convince people to have fewer children. And they looked at it the way Westerners do, in that these people are just dumb. If only we could show them the way to be, they would reduce their population size, and they'd be able to feed each other. So I came up with this mental exercise. You can see it's moving. What if, now this is a what if scenario. What if tomorrow someone invented the perfect birth control method? I'm not saying that they are. I'm just saying what if. And who knows what might be invented in the future. All right, so tomorrow it's going to be announced that there's this perfect birth control method that somebody found. It's 100% effective. It's also 100% safe. There aren't any side effects. There aren't any long-term effects, and it's not harmful to one sex or the other. And also, it's completely easy to learn, easy to use. There's no inconvenience with this. So it's a 100% effective, very easy to use. Everyone can do it. And it would be completely available to everyone in the world, that it's cheap or basically free. So it comes down to just this question. Anyone who wanted to use it could use it. So everybody has access to birth control. Everybody can use it. So it just comes down to the decision to choosing to use it or not. Well, here's the question. So I can ask some of you, what's the answer? How do you think that would change the global birth rate map? Would that change the pattern? Or would the less developed countries still have higher birth rates because of the advantages of having children? And the developed world countries would continue to have the lowest birth rates. Now, with technology and diffusion of technology, that it is important that if people choose not to have children, then they shouldn't have children. But these children are wanted. Because all through those days when we talked about overpopulation, students would point to these people in the less developed countries and say, there's something wrong with them. They're having big families that they can't afford. Well, there's social traditions for that. And there's also the perception that a large family is good. That's not going to change overnight. So the world will continue to grow in population, even though it's expected to level off. Also, I look at the numbers every year, because every year there's a new textbook and a new table, new maps, and I look at these. Well, fertility has been coming down all over the world. All right, let me go on to the next slide, or perhaps this is a good